You think being interested in psychology content is just curiosity or personality. Maslow discovered something revealing in his research on human development. He found that people at different levels of his hierarchy are naturally attracted to fundamentally different types of information, ideas, and content. And what captures your attention reveals where you currently are in psychological development. People seeking certain types of understanding aren't randomly curious. They're gravitating toward information that matches their current developmental needs and challenges. The most revealing part? Maslow identified that your intellectual interests, the questions that preoccupy you, and the content you seek out are diagnostic indicators of your position in the hierarchy. This isn't about intelligence or education. It's about developmental stage. And understanding why specific psychological content resonates with you reveals crucial information about what needs you're currently working to satisfy and what developmental tasks you're facing. What feels fascinating to you isn't random. It's your consciousness seeking exactly what serves your current growth. Not every person interested in psychology is at the same developmental level. There's a critical difference between seeking psychological information to solve deficiency problems and seeking it to support growth beyond deficiency. Maslow observed that people operating from lower needs are drawn to content about fixing problems, how to reduce anxiety, manage relationships, achieve success, gain confidence. These are legitimate needs, and seeking this information is developmentally appropriate. But people operating from higher needs are drawn to different content. Questions about meaning, consciousness, authenticity, transcendence. They're not trying to fix what's broken, but exploring what's possible beyond normal functioning. This isn't superior or inferior. It's different developmental territory. What appears as similar interests in psychology from outside reflects completely different motivations and needs from inside. Real understanding requires recognizing that the same subject can be approached from multiple developmental levels, each seeking different information for different purposes. And your specific attraction to certain psychological content, including this video, reveals more about your current developmental stage than you might realize. In this video, I'm going to reveal what Maslow's hierarchy explains about why different people are attracted to different psychological content, what your specific interests reveal about your current developmental position, and how content preferences naturally shift as you develop through the stages. You'll discover why certain psychological topics fascinate you while leaving others cold, and what that pattern indicates about the needs you're currently working to satisfy. These are insights from humanistic psychology about how developmental level determines what information feels relevant, important, or transformative. By the end, you'll understand what your attraction to psychology content, including videos like this, actually reveals about where you are in your development. This isn't a video claiming you're special or already evolved for being here. This is psychology explaining how content preferences correlate with developmental stages in ways that provide insight into your current position and next challenges. This video is for people interested in understanding themselves more accurately rather than receiving flattery. If you're genuinely curious about why certain psychological ideas captivate you while others feel irrelevant, if you want to understand what your intellectual interests reveal about your developmental work, if you're interested in how your content preferences will likely shift as you continue growing, this will provide genuine insight. If you're ready to understand what psychology reveals about the connection between developmental stage and content attraction, keep watching. Think about the psychological content you've been drawn to over the past year, the videos you've watched, the books you've read, the topics you've researched. Notice the specific themes that capture your attention. Are you primarily interested in techniques for managing anxiety, building confidence, or achieving goals? Are you drawn to understanding relationship dynamics, attachment patterns, or social connection? Are you fascinated by questions about meaning, purpose, or consciousness? Are you exploring peak experiences, transcendence, or the nature of self? That pattern of interest isn't random. It's precisely diagnostic of your current position in Maslow's hierarchy. People don't randomly become interested in transcendence while struggling with basic safety needs. And people who've satisfied belonging needs don't obsessively consume content about how to make friends. Your consciousness gravitates toward information that serves your current developmental work, and it largely ignores information that's either already integrated or not yet relevant. The psychological weight of this pattern is that your content consumption, reveals your developmental position more accurately than self-report often does. Because what actually captures your attention reflects your real needs rather than what you think you should need or want to be working on. Maslow's hierarchy provides a complete framework for understanding content attraction at each developmental level. At the physiological and safety levels, people are primarily interested in content about survival, security, health, and stability. They're drawn to information about making money, staying healthy, avoiding danger, or managing basic resources. Psychological content at this level focuses on anxiety management, stress reduction, or achieving financial security. This isn't shallow. It's developmentally appropriate when these needs are genuinely unmet or threatened. At the love and belonging level, content interest shifts dramatically toward relationships, connection, social skills, and understanding others. People here are drawn to attachment theory, communication techniques, understanding family dynamics, or building friendships. They want to know how to connect, how to be loved, how to maintain relationships. Psychological content about authentic connection, vulnerability, or belonging resonates deeply because it addresses their primary developmental work. At the esteem level, interest shifts again toward achievement, confidence, success strategies, and self-improvement. People are drawn to content about productivity, goal setting, building self-worth, or becoming successful. They want psychological understanding that helps them achieve, perform, and gain recognition. Content about imposter syndrome, perfectionism, or building confidence captures attention because it addresses esteem challenges. At the self-actualization level, something fundamental changes. Interest shifts from solving problems to exploring potential. People become fascinated by creativity, authenticity, meaning, purpose, and self-knowledge. They're drawn to content about finding your calling, living authentically, or maximizing your unique potential. Psychological content about individuation, authenticity, or self-expression resonates because they're working on becoming fully themselves rather than fixing what's wrong. At the transcendence level, which Maslow added late in his career, interest shifts yet again toward consciousness itself, unity experiences, ego transcendence, and ultimate questions about existence. People here are drawn to content about peak experiences, non-dual awareness, death acceptance, or the nature of consciousness. They're no longer primarily interested in personal development, but in understanding consciousness beyond the personal. Here's the pattern that reveals everything. You can only be genuinely interested in content that addresses developmental work one stage ahead of where you've integrated. Content addressing needs you've satisfied feels boring or obvious. Content addressing needs 2 stages ahead feels irrelevant or incomprehensible. But content addressing your current work or the next stage captures your attention completely because it's precisely what your development requires now. The psychologist Claire Graves studied developmental stages extensively and created what he called spiral dynamics, a model showing how values, interests, and worldview shift predictably as people develop through stages. His research confirmed what Maslow observed. People at different stages literally live in different psychological realities, interested in different questions, attracted to different content. The cognitive developmentalist Jean Piaget documented how intellectual interests change as cognitive structures develop. Children can only be interested in questions their current cognitive stage allows them to formulate. Adults are similarly constrained. You can only seek answers to questions your developmental level makes visible. The psychologist Robert Kegan studied how the self evolves through stages, and he found that each stage makes certain questions possible while rendering others invisible. You're not choosing to ignore content irrelevant to your stage. You literally cannot see its relevance because your current developmental structure doesn't recognize it as addressing real needs. The philosopher Ken Wilber synthesized developmental models across multiple domains and confirmed that content resonance is stage-specific. What feels profound at one stage feels obvious or irrelevant at another, not because you become smarter, but because you've integrated that developmental territory. Insider knowledge from developmental psychology reveals what Maslow intuited. Your content preferences are extraordinarily accurate diagnostic tools for identifying developmental position, more reliable than self-assessment because they reveal what you're actually working on rather than what you think you should be working on. But here's what Maslow's framework reveals about what your specific attraction to psychological content indicates about your developmental position. If you're primarily drawn to content about managing anxiety, building financial security, or achieving stability, you're likely operating primarily from safety needs. This isn't criticism. It means your developmental work involves creating a security foundation that makes higher development possible. Your next stage will involve shifting attention toward connection and belonging once safety is sufficiently established. If you're primarily drawn to content about relationships, attachment, connection, or understanding social dynamics, you're likely operating primarily from love and belonging needs. Your developmental work involves learning to connect authentically and building secure relationships. Your next stage will involve building self-esteem and pursuing achievement once belonging is sufficiently satisfied. If you're primarily drawn to content about success, productivity, confidence, or achievement, you're likely operating primarily from esteem needs. Your developmental work involves building genuine self-worth and capacity for accomplishment. Your next stage will involve shifting from achievement for validation toward authenticity and meaning once esteem is sufficiently established. If you're drawn to content about meaning, purpose, authenticity, creativity, or self-actualization, content like many videos on this channel, you're likely operating primarily from self-actualization needs. Your developmental work involved becoming fully yourself, expressing your unique nature, and finding personally meaningful engagement with life. This suggests you've substantially satisfied lower needs and are working on growth motivation rather than deficiency motivation. Your next stage, if development continues, involves transcendence where personal development gives way to transpersonal concerns. If you're drawn to content about consciousness itself, transcendence, peak experiences, ego death, or ultimate questions about existence, you're likely operating at or approaching transcendence. Your developmental work involves moving beyond personal concerns toward recognizing consciousness as primary and individual self as temporary formation within it. This is rare developmental territory that relatively few people reach. Here's the crucial insight. The content you're drawn to reveals where you are, not where you wish you were or think you should be. If you're genuinely fascinated by transcendence content, but your actual life concerns are dominated by relationship problems or financial anxiety, you're likely operating from lower needs while being intellectually interested in higher stages. That's common. Conceptual understanding can run ahead of developmental integration. But what actually serves your development is addressing your real current needs, not consuming content about stages you haven't reached yet. The transformation that occurs when you understand what your content preferences reveal is that you can work with your development more consciously rather than consuming content randomly. Remember that frustration when psychological insights don't seem to help, when understanding doesn't translate to change. Often it's because you're consuming content aimed at a different developmental level than where you actually are. Understanding changes several things immediately. Your content consumption becomes more targeted. Instead of randomly consuming whatever sounds interesting, you can identify what addresses your actual current developmental work. If you're working on esteem needs, content about transcendence isn't helpful yet, it's premature. Content about building confidence and capacity serves you now. Your self-judgment often decreases because you recognize that being at whatever stage you're at isn't failure. You're not supposed to be transcendent while still building basic security. That's not how development works. You're exactly where your history and circumstances have brought you, and your work is continuing from there, not feeling ashamed you're not further along. Your expectations become more realistic. You stop expecting single insights to transform everything because you understand that development happens in stages, each requiring substantial integration work before the next becomes accessible. You recognize that consuming content about advanced stages doesn't advance you. Doing the actual developmental work of your current stage does. Your patience with your own process often increases because you recognize development takes time, that you cannot skip stages, and that each stage is essential work that makes the next possible. Even your relationship with frustration transforms because you can identify when you're frustrated by stage-specific challenges rather than by personal deficiency. The challenge of building self-esteem when you have fragile self-worth isn't personal failure. It's the normal difficulty of that developmental task. Now here's where everything becomes practically useful rather than just intellectually interesting, and where understanding content attraction transforms into developmental guidance. You can use your content preferences diagnostically to identify where you are and what needs attention. First, Notice what psychological content genuinely fascinates you. Not what sounds impressive, but what captures your actual attention and feels personally relevant. That reveals your current developmental focus. Second, notice what content feels boring or obvious. That likely indicates needs you've substantially satisfied. You're past that developmental territory. Third, notice what content feels incomprehensible or irrelevant. That likely indicates developmental stages you haven't reached yet. The questions don't feel real to you because you're not working on that territory. Fourth, notice any gap between what you're intellectually interested in and what your actual life concerns involve. If you're fascinated by transcendence while your daily experience is dominated by anxiety about security, you're likely consuming content that's ahead of your actual developmental position. This isn't bad, but it means the content won't help until you address the actual needs your system is working on. Fifth, use this information to guide your development consciously. Focus energy on satisfying the needs your content preferences reveal you're actually working on, rather than trying to force development into territories you're not ready for. If you're working on belonging, invest in building real relationships rather than consuming content about self-actualization. If you're working on esteem, focus on building actual competence and worth rather than reading about transcendence. Each stage requires genuine integration work, psychological healing, skill development, relationship building, whatever that stage demands. Consuming content about where you want to be doesn't move you there. Doing the actual developmental work of where you are does. The content consumption is valuable for understanding, guidance, and support, but it's not substitute for the actual living that integrates each stage. Here's the pattern that Maslow documented and that developmental psychology confirms. Development happens through stages that cannot be skipped. Each stage requires substantial integration before the next becomes accessible, and attempting to bypass stages through intellectual understanding creates problems. The spiritual bypass, where people try to transcend without building healthy ego, is an example of trying to skip stages. It doesn't work. The unmet needs continue controlling behavior unconsciously while the person believes they've transcended them. If you're watching this video, here's what it actually reveals about your development, without flattery or manipulation. First, you're interested in psychology and self-understanding, which suggests you've satisfied basic survival needs sufficiently to have attention available for self-reflection. People in survival mode don't consume psychology content. They're too busy surviving. Second, your interest in Maslow's hierarchy and developmental psychology suggests you're somewhere in the self-actualization range or approaching it. People operating primarily from deficiency needs are typically drawn to content addressing their specific deficiencies rather than to comprehensive developmental models. Third, your interest in advanced topics like transcendence, consciousness, and peak experiences, if those topics appear in content you consume, suggests you're either working on or intellectually interested in territories beyond basic self-actualization. But interest doesn't equal achievement. You might be genuinely working on transcendence, or you might be intellectually curious about it while actually working on earlier stages. Only you can determine which through honest self-assessment of what needs actually dominate your daily experience. Fourth, the fact that you've watched this far suggests you're interested in understanding yourself accurately rather than just receiving flattering assessment. That's itself a marker of some developmental maturity, the willingness to examine yourself honestly rather than seeking ego validation. But here's what being here doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you're already evolved, transcendent, or special. It means you're interested in development, which is wonderful and valuable, but interest isn't the same as integration. It doesn't mean you should be at any particular stage. Development happens at its own pace based on countless factors beyond your control. It doesn't mean consuming this content will advance your development by itself. Content provides understanding and guidance, but actual development requires living, healing, relating, creating, risking, and integrating in the real world. What it does mean, you're somewhere on the developmental path with enough security to reflect on that path. You're interested in understanding rather than just coping. You're open to psychological insight about yourself. And you're likely working on developmental challenges somewhere in the self-actualization range, which is statistically uncommon and valuable. That's worth acknowledging without inflating it into something it's not. Maslow's final insight about content attraction and development was that people often become interested in the next stage before they're ready to integrate it. And that premature interest can actually slow development if it leads to bypassing current stage work. He found that self-actualized people often became fascinated by transcendence before completing self-actualization work, and that fascination sometimes prevented the groundwork that makes transcendence stable. His advice, implicit in his work, was to focus on satisfying the needs of your current stage thoroughly before reaching for the next. The better you complete each stage, the more stable and sustainable your development becomes. If you're genuinely interested in your own development rather than in feeling advanced, the most valuable question isn't what stage am I at, but what does my current stage require for completion? If you're working on safety, focus on building actual security, financial stability, safe environment, health. If you're working on belonging, focus on building real relationships, practicing vulnerability, developing attachment security, creating genuine connections. If you're working on esteem, focus on building actual competence and worth, developing skills, achieving things that matter to you, learning to value yourself appropriately. If you're working on self-actualization, focus on authentic self-expression, discovering what's uniquely yours to contribute, living from your actual values, creating from your genuine nature. If you're working on transcendence, focus on practices that support ego transcendence while maintaining functionality, meditation, contemplation, practices that shift identity beyond personal. Whatever stage you're actually working on deserves your full attention and energy rather than being rushed through to reach something that sounds more impressive. In the next video, I'm going to reveal the specific practices that support development at each stage of Maslow's hierarchy, including how to identify what your current stage requires and how to work with it effectively rather than trying to bypass it. Until then, use your content preferences as honest diagnostic rather than flattering assessment. What captures your genuine attention reveals where you actually are and what work serves you now. Subscribe if you want to understand complete psychology of development through Maslow's stages, including practical guidance for whatever stage you're actually working on rather than the stage you wish you were at.